Chapter 27 of Nicholas Nickleby takes us to the heart of the novel, because delightful though Nicholas's excursions to Yorkshire with Squeers and down to Portsmouth with Cromwells are, and despite the fact that Dickens cunningly weaves those episodes into the book, actually it's a family drama at heart. It concerns the situation of a family without a father. And in this chapter, we see Kate Nickleby, Nicholas's sister, facing the depredations of a dastardly and ruthless aristocrat, Sir Mulberry Hawk, backed up by his cronies, and the powerlessness of a woman in that situation. And particularly poignant is the scene because her own mother, Mrs. Nickleby, fails to see the danger at all, indeed actively encourages the Mulberry Hawk in his attentions, is flattered by them. I'm very much afraid to say that this is a rather cruel portrait of Dickens's own mother, who, like Mrs. Nickleby, was given to rather long prattling anecdotes, and also who completely failed to read the real situation all too often. And we also meet here the delightful and very sensitive Mrs. Wititterly and her husband Wititterly himself. So, chapter 27. It takes place, incidentally, in a theatre, but a very grander theatre than any that Vincent Crummles and his troupe would ever appear in. Don't you see Sir Mulberry Hawk, my dear? Kate bowed slightly and, biting her lip, turned her head towards the stage. But Sir Mulberry Hawk was not to be so easily repulsed, for he advanced with extended hand, and Mrs. Nickleby officiously informing Kate of this circumstance, she was obliged to extend her own. Sir Mulberry detained it, while he murmured a profusion of compliments, which Kate, remembering what had passed between them, rightly considered as so many aggravations of the insult he had already put upon her. Then followed the recognition of Lord Verisopht, and then the greeting of Mr. Pike, and then that of Mr. Pluck. And finally, to complete the young lady's mortification, she was compelled, at Mrs. Wititterly's request, to perform the ceremony of introducing the odious persons whom she regarded with the utmost indignation and abhorrence. Mrs. Wititterly is delighted, said Mr. Wititterly, rubbing his hands. Delighted, my lord, I'm sure, with this opportunity of contracting an acquaintance which I trust, my lord, we shall improve. Julia, my dear, you must not allow yourself to be too much excited. You must not. Indeed, you must not. Mrs. Wititterly is of the most excitable nature, Sir Mulberry. The snuff of a candle, the wick of a lamp, the bloom on a peach, the down on a butterfly. You might blow her away, my lord. You might blow her away. Sir Mulberry seemed to think that it would be a great convenience if the lady could be blown away. He said, however, that the delight was mutual, and Lord Verisopht added that it was mutual, whereupon Messrs. Pike and Pluck were heard to murmur from the distance that it was very mutual indeed. I take an interest, my lord, said Mrs. Wititterly with a faint smile, such an interest in the drama. Yes, it's very interesting, replied Lord Verisopht. I'm always ill after Shakespeare, said Mrs. Wititterly. I scarcely exist the next day. I find the reaction so very great after a tragedy, my lord, and Shakespeare is such a delicious creature. Yes, replied Lord Verisopht, he was a clever man. Do you know, my lord, said Mrs. Wititterly after a long silence, I find I take so much more interest in his plays after having been to that dear little dull house he was born in. Were you ever there, my lord? No, never, replied Lord Verisopht. Then really you ought to go, my lord, returned Mrs. Wititterly, in very languid and drawling accents. I don't know how it is, but after you've seen the place and written your name in the little book, somehow or other you seem to be inspired. It kindles up quite a fire within one. Yes, replied Lord Verisopht, I shall certainly go there. Julia, my life, interposed Mr. Whitterly, you are deceiving his lordship. Unintentionally, my lord, she is deceiving you. It is your poetical temperament, my dear, your ethereal soul, your fervid imagination, which throws you into a glow of genius and excitement. There's nothing in the place, my dear. Nothing. Nothing. I think there must be something in the place, said Mrs. Nickleby, who had been listening in silence, for soon after I was married, I went to Stratford with my poor dear Mr. Nickleby in a post-chaise from Birmingham. Was it a post-chaise, though? Said Mrs. Nickleby, considering. Yes, it must have been a post-chaise, because I recollect remarking at the time that the driver had a green shade over his left eye. Yes, in a post-chaise from Birmingham. After we'd seen Shakespeare's tomb and birthplace, we went back to the inn there, where we slept that night, and I recollect that all night long I dreamt of nothing but a black gentleman at full length in plaster of Paris, with a lay-down collar tied with 2 tassels, leaning against a post and thinking. And when I woke in the morning and described him to Mr. Nickleby, he said it was Shakespeare, just as he had been when he was alive, which was very curious indeed. Stratford, considered Mrs. Nickleby. Yes, I'm positive about that, because I recollect I was in the family way with my son Nicholas at the time, and I'd been very much frightened by an Italian image boy that very morning. In fact, it was quite a mercy, ma'am, added Mrs. Nickleby in a whisper to Mrs. Whititterly, that my son didn't turn out to be a Shakespeare. What a dreadful thing that would have been. When Mrs. Nickleby had brought this interesting anecdote to a close, Pike and Pluck, ever zealous in their patron's cause, proposed the adjournment of a detachment of the party into the next box. And with so much skill were the preliminaries adjusted that Kate, despite all she could say or do to the contrary, had no alternative but to suffer herself to be led away by Sir Mulberry Hawk. Her mother and Mr. Pluck accompanied them. But the worthy lady, pluming herself upon her discretion, took particular care not so much as to look at her daughter during the whole evening, and to seem wholly absorbed in the jokes and conversation of Mr. Pluck, who, having been appointed sentry over Mrs. Nickleby for that especial purpose, neglected on his side no possible opportunity of engrossing her attention. Lord Frederick Verisopht remained in the next box to be talked to by Mrs. Whititterly, and Mr. Pike was in attendance to throw in a word or two when necessary. As to Mr. Whititterly, he was sufficiently busy in the body of the house, informing such of his friends and acquaintance as happened to be there that those 2 gentlemen upstairs whom they had seen in conversation with Mrs. W. were the distinguished Lord Frederick Verisopht and his most intimate friend, the gay Sir Mulberry Hawk, a communication which inflamed several respectable housekeepers with the utmost jealousy and rage, and reduced 16 unmarried daughters to the very brink of despair. The evening came to an end at last, but Kate had yet to be handed downstairs by the detested Sir Mulberry, and so skilfully were the manoeuvres of Messrs. Pike and Pluck conducted, that she and the baronet were the last of the party, and were, even without an appearance of effort or design, left at some little distance behind. Don't hurry, said Sir Mulberry, as Kate hastened on and attempted to release her arm. She made no reply, but still pressed forward. Nay, then, coolly observed Sir Mulberry, stopping her outright. You had best not seek to detain me, sir, said Kate angrily. Why not? Retorted Sir Mulberry. My dear creature, now, why do you keep up this show of displeasure? Show? Repeated Kate indignantly. How dare you presume to speak to me, sir, to address me, to come into my presence? You look prettier in passion, Miss Nickleby, said Sir Mulberry Hawk, stooping down the better to see her face. I hold you in the bitterest detestation and contempt, sir, said Kate. If you find any attraction in looks of disgust, An aversion. Let me rejoin my friends, sir, instantly. Whatever considerations may have withheld me thus far, I will disregard them all, and take a course that even you might feel, if you do not immediately suffer me to proceed. Sir Mulberry smiled, and still looking in her face and retaining her arm, walked towards the door. If no regard for my sex or helpless situation will induce you to desist from this coarse and unmanly prosecution, said Kate, scarcely knowing, in the tumult of her passions, what she said, I have a brother who will resent it dearly one day. Upon my soul, exclaimed Sir Mulberry, as though quietly communing with himself, passing his arm round her waist as he spoke. She looks more beautiful, and I like her better in this mood than when her eyes are cast down and she's in perfect repose. How Kate reached the lobby where her friends were waiting she never knew, but she hurried across it without at all regarding them, and disengaged herself suddenly from her companion, sprang into the coach, and throwing herself into its darkest corner, burst into tears.